Great. So we are going to get started with today's masterclass. So I just want to thank everyone for joining today. My name is Connor Kelly. I'm a junior consultant here at Turner and Townsend, and we are joined today by both Adam Pannell and Stuart Wigley, and they will be leading the masterclass today. So this is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Connor. Here's the agenda in terms of picking up the purpose and outcomes that we're looking to achieve from the session. Adam will be picking up items relating to public sector procurement, and then thinking about information requirements, the assessment criteria when you respond to framework opportunities, looking at pricing approaches, and in particular, what happens if you have an abnormally low tender, and looking at contract terms, and then looking at some top tips in terms of some practical experience of delivering tenders, and then areas of further learning. And Connor will provide us with some details regarding further information that's available through the RISE initiative. So in terms of thinking about purpose and outcomes, so the purpose of today is, given recent significant announcements from the government, there's the need for clients to engage with the supply chain and potentially deliver at scale in terms of the volumes that we're talking about. So the purpose of today is to think about how the procurement process needs to be accessed in order to produce the outputs that are required in terms of delivery of the retrofit program of works. We also would like to raise awareness of where retrofit opportunities are likely to be advertised, and also highlight what the process involves. And in particular, the work will be advertised via public procurement tendering. And finally, as I said, picking up some practical top tips in terms of what that entails. In terms of outcomes, hopefully at the end of the session, you'll be able to provide feedback in terms of knowing where to look in terms of and register for outcome opportunities with regards to retrofit opportunities, what's required when you respond to the tender process, and to think about the practical considerations when you do respond, and looking at opportunities and to find out whether they're a good fit for your organisation and one that you should be responding to. And lastly, we'll be ideally getting the outcome in terms of the practical implications of what the tender process entails, both in terms of pricing and the practical applications in terms of contract conditions. So moving to the detail, I'll now hand over to Adam to look at the public sector procurement.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm going to take a few minutes to try and summarise the exciting world of public procurement. So this information we've provided here is just to kind of identify the kind of scale of the opportunity in terms of retrofit projects. So recently published information about the oversubscribed applications really for the kind of warm homes and the social housing decarbonisation funds, etc. So I think it was over £1 billion oversubscribed is the figure I've got in my head. But what it identifies is that there's a lot of interest from client organisations in terms of obtaining funding to proceed with kind of retrofit projects and having a look at their existing stock. So significant funding obviously requires significant resources to deliver them opportunities. And there are obviously implications with having numerous opportunities in the market at one particular point and challenges to overcome. And this is always a mouthful for me to say as well, but we identify that outputs will only be achieved if the supply chain are fit for purpose in terms of retrofit projects. So what does this mean? Now, in terms of public sector procurement, to highlight the purpose of public sector procurement, it's meant to be all of these things. So it's meant to breed kind of transparency. It's focused a lot more on value for money rather than the cheapest tender wins. It's a competitive process. You very rarely will get public service procurement that is a negotiated tender. It often always has to be a competitive process. It's meant to breed kind of equality in terms of all suppliers and tenders are treated the same, and it does have stringent kind of processes in place to have a bit more of an accountability. In terms of delivery, it is by local authorities and housing providers, and they have to follow obviously public sector requirements, and recently kind of enabled Public Procurement Act 2023 kind of identified a lot more stringent processes to go through. In terms of how they're published, generally there's a find a tender service, which is a government kind of service portal. Any open kind of market tenders will be published on that and have obviously relevant details. There are also numerous frameworks. I could probably put a couple of letters together in an acronym and hit a framework name like LHC, SEC, for example. There's a couple of examples there. And they will regularly publish opportunities that come onto their framework. Regarding kind of what the information is going to tell you, what you are looking for generally is that there's a brief project description, obviously deadlines when that needs to be submitted, quite important because most tenders will be very strict, and if you miss that deadline, that submission will not be considered. In terms of how to download and access information, it should be quite self-evident in that sense, but it would have all the relevant information that they feel you need for that tender. And then that's your opportunity, if you think there's some missing information, to clarify that. But all of them process will be detailed out in that advertisement. Procurement routes, it will touch on what the chosen procurement route is. So if it's single stage, two-stage tendering, I think we touch a bit more on that later. Additional routes, additional JCTs or a measured term kind of contracts, all of them kind of elements should be identified in that advertisement. And just the last point there we mentioned is, I did just touch on the Procurement Act. Some frameworks, usually they last for kind of 4 to 5 years. So any frameworks that were kind of set up and in place before the Procurement Act came into power and may be assessed kind of under different rules. It's kind of important to identify what framework you're using and what opportunity, what guidelines obviously apply to that procurement. Regarding types of procurement, majority of frameworks we tend to see are kind of closed frameworks. So that's when a new framework starting or a framework coming to an end and they're renewing a framework, they'll invite suppliers to bid with certain requirements they have to go through to achieve a place on that framework. But generally, you don't have opportunities during the duration of that framework to then get on board if you wanted to. So it is generally, once you're on, it's great. But if you don't get on, then you've got to wait another kind of 4 or 5 years to have that opportunity again. Open framework wise is very similar to the closed framework in terms of you have to bid to get onto it, but they generally have opportunities to open it up every few years to invite further people to apply to obviously join them, and potentially some tenderers on that framework may be omitted from the list at that point. So it's a bit more of a flexible approach to long kind of term frameworks, and obviously their own benefits and drawbacks to that. Dynamic market is a lot more flexible than any of them kind of options that I just discussed. Similar to the DPS, so we love our acronyms here. So the dynamic purchasing system, which is generally you can join the framework at any point during the duration, as long as you meet the requirements set out for that service. So a lot more of a flexible approach. The downside is generally they don't have a limit of how many people can join that system. So you could have lots of competitors on that system. It's kind of becomes a bit more of an open market process. To touch on competitive tendering, as I said, pretty much all public procurement will be competitive. They have what we call an open procedure, which is generally a single stage procedure where you obviously have to submit your requirements to fulfill that tender, how it's been set out, and the information that they request you to provide. Generally, then these kind of tenders, you have a bit more of a longer period because they'll give you all the information and they want you to kind of submit that firm binding cost. Benefits of that, obviously, from the client side, they'll get that kind of all-in cost of, this is what it's going to be. And generally with tenders, they'll have all the information up front. The downside is obviously a bit unflexible in terms of you don't get that kind of buy-in from the contractor. You don't get their input into how the design's going to develop, that kind of stuff, buildability issues on site. Generally, the people that are tendering for these projects are the experts. So it sometimes isn't seen as a collaborative approach to be able to get them on board and have some solutions before you submit your tender. The competitive flexible procedure is kind of the opposite to what I just said. It's two-stage tendering generally. It might have some mini competitions, for example, to get through the first stage of tendering and reduce the number of tenderers involved. It's requirements like that can be set out. Benefits of that, obviously, bringing someone on board kind of early on in the stage in the process, and you can get their input then into kind of buildability issues, which generally can come across quite well. I'm now going to pass you back over to my colleague, Stuart.
Thank you, Adam. So Adam sort of summarised where opportunities can be found and located and what the framework opportunities entail. So if we start to think about the information requirements with regards to what information is likely to be required if you were to respond to a tender opportunity, we've got some areas here to talk through further. First one is the pre-qualification questionnaires. So the aim of these is to assess your suitability for undertaking the contract. So that will ask information about your organisation, about how you undertake the work and the size of your organisation, and some basic information about your organisation and what you do and how you procure works. In terms of method statements, this tries to get into the specifics in terms of how you undertake retrofit works. So that'll be focusing on your proposals to respond to the tender opportunity. And in particular, an aspect of this is in terms of risk and how you manage risk. So all construction projects have an element of risk, and retrofit opportunities also have an element of risk. So a number of method statements are likely to tease out of you what your approach to dealing with these risks are. In terms of technical specification, you'd expect to see some technical details in terms of the works, describing the scope and extent of works. So again, part of that assessment criteria will be your review of that technical aspect, and again, responding with your proposals in terms of whether you're able to meet those specific requirements and how you intend to do that. And lastly, we've put in there the risks and risk assessments. So again, some of the hazards that you're likely to experience and the ability to put together your strategy for any mitigation measures. Other items in terms of information requirements will include certificates such as insurances, so details of the insurances that you have in place, the level that they're at, the levels of indemnity, and when they expire. Financial information, and we'll come on to why that's important with regards to your latest set of accounts. So a variety of these retrofit opportunities will be different in size, complexity, and scale. So it's trying to make sure that if you are a supplier, that you're well suited to the opportunities that are being advertised. And also thinking about supplier code. So similar to the ability that where you have a driving license and you can share that with a potential someone that you're hiring a car from. Similarly, when you do an SQ, you're able to produce a supplier code and share that with a potential supplier rather than having to regurgitate it again. So it's a quick way of sharing information effectively and efficiently. Adam, you'll now pick up the assessment criteria.
Thank you very much. So to summarise this page really is cost is always an important factor, but in many tender evaluations, it's not always the deciding one. So it's very important to understand that price doesn't always drive results. The quality and value, we've touched on this quite a bit. Quality has become of increased importance over the last few years, especially. We've had obviously a number of high-profile incidents, Grenfell, Arab's Law, for example. Major incidents that have driven the focus towards quality. So a lot of tenders now are focusing a lot more about what the quality of the tender, the quality of the bid, rather than just kind of cutting costs and going for the cheapest tender submission. So it's important to understand that when we mention value, we're not talking about it being the least expensive. We're talking about value for money, what that tenderer is going to bring to the table that demonstrates higher and better value for money than other tenderers. Compliance with requirements is to touch on, all tenders need to be compliant with the latest requirements, and it's important that you are aware of what the latest requirements are. We're talking big kind of legislative changes like the Building Safety Act. You need to be aware of any implications that might have on your project. If they're not compliant, then it's likely that it's going to be disqualified, and all that time you've put into producing that tender bid will be wasted. And in experience and track record, some frameworks incorporate KPIs, so key performance indicators, and reviews and assessments of how you've performed on them frameworks. The Procurement Act, actually, the new Procurement Act of 2023 has actually highlighted a lot more focus on KPIs, and I think it's a new debarment list, I believe it's called. So there's a new list actually that's on the Find My Tender system that will have a kind of list of naughty contractors, I suppose, the way of putting it there. So on the flip side of that is, if you're performing well and hitting good kind of indicators, then that should be reflected and recognised. So a lot more importance kind of put onto the fact of your track record, which is a good thing. So that's risk management wise. So a lot of tenderers will pick up how the tenderer has dealt with specific risks. A low cost submission could indicate a risk, but it could also indicate that you might be, submitting a low cost for a reason. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are struggling, desperate to win work. It might be a choice that you've made. But it also touched on that, if there are site-specific risks and a tender has identified these, then it demonstrates the tender has taken their time to properly assess the information and has actually come up with a proposal of how they're going to deal with that risk. On the other side of that, a tender has kind of identified there might be a risk and just kind of omitted it or excluded it from their tender, just kind of holding hands and saying, look, we're not going to deal with that. That might not be seen as being obviously a collaborative approach by the client. So it's kind of not as attractive to clients than tenderers that have dealt with them risks. Innovation and added value, touched kind of on, the word value before. So, some tenders we see sometimes might come up with different solutions and different methods of construction or different technology that might actually be a higher capital cost, but actually might have kind of longer benefits to the client, whole life kind of cost in here. And sorry, someone is blind calling me on Teams, which is throwing me off the track there. And it offers better value over the long term, not just kind of focusing on the immediate capital cost. And that is always a good opportunity to kind of demonstrate your knowledge on innovative materials and methods. In terms of sustainability and social value, increasingly on all tenders, there is a social value element. I don't think we've touched on it yet, but generally tenderers are assessed on a price and quality split. But a lot of tenderers now doing a price and quality split and a social value split as well. So you might see a 40% of the mark being awarded for price, 50% being awarded for quality, and then 10% being awarded for your social value answer. And that generally touches on, keeping local material, using local materials, using local subcontractors, keeping that money kind of in the local community, apprenticeships, that kind of thing, like, offering of training, demonstrations to residents on how you're using, new technologies. All of that kind of stuff is great to see in tenders and really benefits the local community. And then all of that really comes to the question of to bid or not to bid. So there's many considerations that may influence whether you are going to invest the time to collate all the information to submit a tender. It is a massive commitment to make when you are submitting tenders, because all of that time and effort, if you don't win the job, then it's kind of, worthless to you. So you do have to consider whether it's a sufficient, an opportunity that you want to go for. It might not be kind of driven by costs. It might be you want to get in with a new client and build that relationship with them, and that you can deliver a great service. So once you're in the door, then you deliver that great project. Repeat business will hopefully come your way. So there might be considerations you take in terms of investing that time to submit a kind of competitive bid that's going to win you that project and have a longer term relationship. Do you have capacity? We touched on that at the beginning. Potentially there's going to be lots of opportunities coming up for retrofit projects. And if you've overcapacified in terms of committed to various projects at once, there could be consequences to that if you can't then complete your works on time on other projects. So it needs to be a consideration there. In terms of securing your projects in workload, geographical locations, generally there's going to be kind of lots of opportunities, and there'll be different kind of lots on frameworks that you can submit for opportunities for. That might be specific to areas, southeast, southwest, kind of London, or north. It's specific to areas, a lot of frameworks. So it's important to understand kind of what is your limit of how far out you're going to travel to be able to perform well on them projects. KPIs, obviously, I have mentioned, and planning time. It's quite evident where you've not had the time planned properly and you've submitted kind of a rush tender, and so definitely kind of planning that in advance, having that kind of review of the information early on, and letting everyone know in your organisation what information you need in a timely manner. It's evident then when people have taken the time to submit something. I believe I'm passing back to you now, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Adam. So, as Adam has indicated, you've assessed the opportunity and decided to go for it. And so one aspect is looking at the price. And as Adam has indicated, price in terms of the composition of the overall marking criteria can account for quite a significant part of it, and sometimes can form up to 40%. So in terms of what the important aspects of a pricing approach, we've got 6 in total, 3 on this particular side. So understanding the tender requirement. So that is going back to the basics in terms of reading and reviewing what the opportunity comprises, understanding the opportunity that you've got, and making sure that the evaluation criteria and the requirements can all be met. And as I said, making sure that you're aware that the pricing criteria can amount to 40%. And we'll touch on later how that 40% is allocated. With regard to your pricing strategy, important aspect there is to look at the cost base that you have, to look at what your overheads and profit will be, and look at those elements that are required to form what your bid will comprise. So you all know better than anyone in terms of being a supplier in the retrofit world, in terms of labour, plant, materials, preliminaries, professional fees, what your appetite for risk, what your appetite to secure the opportunity is as well. So those factors will go into your pricing strategy when ultimately that's collated and then returned. When the pricing submission is completed, generally there's templates to be utilized when you return a price, so making sure that you use the right pricing mechanisms and forms when you put that together, and to make sure that all costs, where they are required to be justified and itemized, and are included. So different pricing documents will have different pricing criteria. So the correct breakdowns are included together with any assumptions and methodologies used when you have put together your price and how it has been calculated. 3 further items in terms of the pricing approach is to review and validate. Adam's mentioned about having sufficient time. So a real top tip there is to check your pricing submission for accuracy. So making sure that the figures collate and actually work through to the total figure, and make sure that they are in alignment with any forms of tender that you need to return. Making sure, obviously, that your price reflects the scope and extent of the works required, and that has been fully understood, and that you're aware of what the obligations are. It goes without saying that you need to submit by the deadline. There's no point in spending all those time and resources putting that hard work in and then finding out that you have missed the deadline. I would think that most public sector procurement will have a timed deadline, and any submission after that deadline will not be assessed and will be excluded. So it's in your interest to make sure that you do return it on time. Engaging clarifications is a key area, I would say, and in particular, being aware that most clients, when you submit a tender, are looking for a clean tender that does not include caveats, exclusions, or conditions. And so one way that you can address those things, rather than waiting to include them within your submission, your price submission, is to engage during the clarification process, and not only keep an eye open for when clarifications are issued, but also submit your own. So if you have got queries about the scope or about the pricing form, or trying to engage and get a better understanding of what's required, then you should engage in the clarification process during the clarification window, and make sure that your queries and observations and comments are submitted and answered in a formal way. So in terms of pricing calculation, and we said that can amount to something like 40% of the overall marks available. They're typically calculated using a proportional scoring system. And here's just a general overview of how that process works. So normally each bid is scored relative to the lowest bid, and the formula used we've just shared here, where there's a weighting and it's the percentage allocated to the cost, is generally if the criteria is out of 40%, then the winning lowest bid generally gets the full marks, which is 40%. And then the price is scored once you've allocated that percentage, is combined with the other criteria, such as social value and quality, to determine the overall score for your bid. And that's where the outcome is provided, and generally the total of all the scores and the highest winning bid, including the price allocation, obviously is the winning bid. Key thing there, I would say, when you're returning your pricing, is that frequently pricing may be included as part of an Excel spreadsheet. So top tip there is not to overtype formulas if a template spreadsheet is provided, and also to check the formulas as well, make sure that they are correct. One aspect in terms of tenders, when you collate your figures, is ideally you don't want to have an abnormally low tender. So an abnormally low tender does mean that potentially it's significantly lower than the others that have been submitted. And there's sort of 9 criteria that we've put together in terms of what that means. Clients will generally identify what that abnormally low tender will comprise and will highlight to you and request clarification for you to respond to their observations on an abnormally low tender. You'll be asked to provide a review and to assess the observations that have been made, and to provide justification as to why your tender, if you consider it is accurate, as to why it is accurate and the reasons for that. It may well be that what they're probing at is economic stability and sustainability in terms of your own organisation. They don't want to put a tender and to place a contract with an organisation that actually can't deliver for the price that's proposed. And the outputs of that is that there's a risk of poor performance if the actual price that's being proposed is uneconomical and can't be delivered. So there's a risk from a client perspective with a very low tender. And that impacts on the supply chain and making sure that there's fair payment and that people valuing the works fairly, submitting a price that's consistent. That's not to say, though, that if you do have an advantage in terms of a justification, maybe that you've got a particular aspect of your service that is innovative and that is cost effective, or perhaps you're working in the area and that there's a real reason for you to have a commercial view and to win this tender. So they all need to be justified as part of this tender process and any queries raised with regard to an abnormally low tender. A risk assessment is undertaken, which aligns with the quality assurance to make sure that the outputs that are required are achieved in line with the scope of the service that's being provided, that's being requested from you. So what the process generally entails in terms of if there is a challenge is verification regarding feasibility, for you to make sure to check, to verify that you're happy with the price and to provide substantiation. And then a decision will be made as to whether the client and contracting authority deem whether it is unsustainable or if it poses a high risk and potentially your tender may be rejected. In terms of avoiding it being classed as abnormally low, what you can do to protect yourself is definitely prepare accurate cost information, provide detailed justification, and a really great way of making sure that your costs are consistent is benchmarking and providing confirmation that from engaging with the marketplace or obtaining benchmark analysis is by comparing your costs with others. So that provides a clear pricing strategy where your price will not be viewed as abnormally low. In terms of contract terms, Adam's going to review what this might entail as part of that tender process.
Yes, now everyone's not as excited about contracts as me, so I will keep this as brief as possible. What we're discussing in terms of as part of a suite of tender documentation that's issued, it's likely there's going to be certain contract terms proposed that would be kind of implemented if your tender is accepted. So it is obviously careful consideration over the implications of them contracting terms. It's normally a condition of the tender that it's agreed as part of that tender process effectively. So, or at least if there's anything you haven't agreed with, it is highlighted. These terms might impact obviously your commercial offer that you're making, and there may also be kind of ongoing liability for the organisation. There might also be other amendments that deal with kind of how certain issues on site are dealt with, access issues or delays, etc. So it's important to understand what contract amendments have been proposed, and that will generally be obviously quite dependent on what procurement route you have gone down as well. In terms of anticipate dates for commencement of work, so that you need to understand when it's likely you're expected to kind of be on site, so obviously in your submission what kind of what you're pricing effectively. If it's not going to be on site for another kind of 4, 5, 6 months from that tender date, then it's important to know that, so you know how to kind of fix your pricing. Generally in submissions, it's a fixed lump sum kind of price. Majority, if not all of what we see tender wise, don't have any kind of fluctuation provisions where you're allowed to amend prices accordingly with inflation, etc. So important to kind of be aware of what has been set out, so you know what you're submitting, that you can hold to that price effectively. And in terms of terms and timescales, generally it will detail out what kind of payment timescales are, what's going to be kind of withheld, whether that typical kind of retention from valuations, what percentage that would be, what the payment terms are. Generally, most clients will amend the kind of default payment terms, so it's maybe 28 days after the due date that you're going to get kind of a final date of payment. So it's always important to understand what implications that might have on your organisation. Other contract terms that are important to understand in terms of insurances, so there will always be insurances required. Each potential opportunity will have a variety of insurances that are needed. Professional liability insurance is probably always needed, but if you are working on an existing building, an occupied building as well, then there might be other implications and insurances that are required, and they all come with a kind of price tag, so important to understand that. If there are any kind of design liabilities on the tenderer, then collateral warranties will be needed, and it's obviously contractual kind of agreements that will need to be entered into subcontractors and subconsultants. So always important to understand your requirements under the building contract that you're entering into. Obligations wise, is majority of contracts will have a defect kind of rectification period, as example, or there might be other kind of maintenance requirements that have been set out, and all of them need to be considered, and should be obviously a price attached to that. Generally it is 12 months. Sometimes it can be shorter, sometimes it can be longer, in 24 months as a rectification period. And what we mean by rectification period is if anything goes wrong, that's a kind of legitimate defect of what works have been completed, then the tenderer will be required to go back and resolve that. And I touched on it before, but in terms of how delays are dealt with, but majority of contracts will have certain clauses to deal with, extensions of time if there are any delays for whatever reason. Some contracts have contract amendments that add new events or omit events from that list. So important you've considered that to feel that you are comfortable with submitting a tender and you'll be able to deliver that. I believe that it should. There we go. I didn't keep you too long about contracts. It could have been ages.
Great. Thank you very much, Adam. So just to conclude, so we've run through with the limited time that we've had. We looked at where the opportunities are likely to come from, what the opportunities are likely to comprise, what a response might look like, both in terms of quality and in terms of cost, looking at pricing and the pricing strategy. And Adam's just reviewed in terms of other obligations in terms of contract. So the time invested is significant. So from our point of view, we've got some practical top tips in terms of pulling that together and some initial feedback. So key things from our point of view. So in terms of just some quick 9 headings, where understanding the requirements is so critical to make sure that you do thoroughly read the tender documents, ensure that you understand all the requirements and criteria, and address each point clearly in your bid. So again, read the question, respond to what the question asks, and make sure that you highlight your response and respond to the questions that are being asked. In terms of be clear and concise, your bid is likely to have some restriction in terms of length, either in terms of page length or in terms of number of words that you use. So again, it's really practical to use plain English and to make sure that you're responses clear and concise within the limited space and words that you have available. Do proofread. Nothing worse than either getting the client name wrong or the wrong project title. Make sure that you have time to proofread, both in terms of reviewing the pricing, but also in terms of the text that you submit. Do tailor your bid, customize it, and make sure that it is specific and picks up the specific requirements. And it's a great opportunity of showcasing your knowledge and how you can show value for money, and in particular, provide case studies to highlight your experience, your expertise, your capabilities, and that they align with the project requirements and needs. By showing value for money, as we said, in terms of the pricing criteria, any innovation, any great ways of how you can provide value for money need to be shared and engage with the client. So using that clarification window that's open to engage and to get any further information or clarification that's required. Key thing is about providing evidence. And again, when questions do ask about providing evidence, a great opportunity of providing case studies, of testimonials, of statistics that demonstrate your ability to deliver projects successfully. So where a question requires you to provide evidence, you do need to answer that and be able to provide proof that you have done work, and case studies is a great way of doing that. Do follow the instructions. Frequently, not only will page length or number of words be there, but also potentially font size. There may be some restriction in terms of the format of how you return and submit the information, uploading to portals or using templates to complete your documentation. And lastly, we've just added there, seek feedback. That if you are in a position that your bid is unsuccessful, seeking feedback to understand why that bid was unsuccessful and looking at areas for improvement is a great way for continuous improvement and making sure that the next time you can refine your approach and hopefully be successful when you pitch and submit a further tender with other opportunities. So thank you very much from Adam and I.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Really informative.